Hello and welcome to the second episode of Unpacking Articles. My name is Florencia Henshaw, that's me right there. I have a PhD in second language acquisition from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. And the article we're going to be unpacking today is dear to my heart because Michael Long has been very influential in my views of SLA as well as what I do in the classroom. The title of the paper is Optimal Input for Language Learning, Genuine, Simplified, Elaborated, or Modified, Elaborated. And essentially what this article is discussing is the dilemma of using authentic resources, authentic input. That means text materials that were not created for language learners. And then the opposite, which would be simplified input, simplified materials, and those are meant for language learners. There are two main issues with authentic input that Michael Long points out. The first one is that it is likely to be not right for their level, and so our efforts in facilitating comprehension of authentic resources the best use of class time, which tends to be very limited to begin with. And the second one is that many times authentic texts come along with inauthentic activities. And so perhaps what we ask the learners to do, it is not an authentic task that people would do to engage with a text. So for example, if all they can do is fill in the blanks with words that they hear, is that an authentic activity? He doesn't deny that there may be some use for those types of activities for language learning, but he wants to emphasize that if that is all we do, then we're staying at the inauthentic level. And he basically sums it up with this quote, that except when employed with very advanced students, genuine text will be linguistically overwhelming and usually constitute psycholinguistically inappropriate input for language learning. So what does this mean? It means that perhaps this type of input, if we are not teaching advanced students, it may not be helping them make the right form-meaning connections, which is essentially how acquisition happens. And so perhaps it may not be the best type of input when it comes to acquisition. On the other hand, simplified input, that means input that has been written or produced for language learners, also has some issues. The first one is that, well, it's inauthentic. It tends to be pretty limiting, contrived, and many times it results in unnatural language. It just doesn't sound like something most people would say. And it tends to contain repetitive use of targeted structures because this simplified input is created with the language in mind first and foremost. And so what I'm wondering is, are we prioritizing how over what? That means, are we prioritizing language over content, over ideas? And Michael Long summarizes why this could be a problem. To focus on language as object and attempt to teach a language structure by structure in the order listed in an externally imposed linguistic syllabus is to disregard much of what has been learned from 50 years of research. This externally imposed linguistic syllabus refers to this list of structures that perhaps we follow based on our textbook, based on what our program wants us to cover, but it's really not the internal syllabus, right? How the learners acquire the language. And so we have this comprehensibility conundrum, that's what I would call it. Yes, we need learners to understand because we know that we need comprehensible input in order to acquire, but at the same time, we don't want to give them impoverished input. So Michael Long looked at interaction. What do people do when they interact and there is a breakdown in communication? Well, for example, if somebody asks, how was your weekend? And maybe the learner's like, was your weekend? Not quite understanding the question. What do most people do? We elaborate. Did you have a good weekend? Did you have fun? We rephrase, we give examples. And that is precisely what Michael Long is advocating for. And he calls it elaborated input. Instead of avoiding words or avoiding structures, add to it, add an example, add an explanation, help them understand without sacrificing or eliminating those new words or those new structures. And yes, it ends up being more redundant, but that might actually be better for acquisition. He also discusses a similar alternative to elaborated input, which he calls modified elaborated input. It is very similar. The premise is the same. The only difference, which to me is very subtle, is that modified elaborated takes more into account the readability of the text. So sometimes you may see more sentences, but perhaps the word count is very similar. So let's not complicate things. Let's focus just on contrasting the three main types of input: authentic, simplified, and elaborated. So here are my own examples. This is my own stab at it. The authentic version would be something like unemployment is on the rise worldwide. Well, you have the word unemployment, you have this phrase on the rise, and then you have worldwide. So let's think about, could the learners understand that? If you simplify it, you could say something like, there are more people without a job everywhere. Are we conveying just about the same meaning? Yes. But notice all of those phrases went away. So how are learners going to be acquiring those phrases if they're nowhere in the input? Voila, elaborated input. Worldwide, everywhere in the world, unemployment is on the rise. There are more people without a job now than before. And so as you can see here, we have kept worldwide, unemployment, and on the rise, but we are helping the learners understand those terms with further input. So one concern is, could all of these additional words and more complexity and longer sentences, could that be confusing for the students? Michael Long says, no, it is not necessarily bad. It could actually be good for acquisition. And his evidence comes from studies that have compared these three types of input and essentially concluded that elaborated input does not lead to more confusion. But I think it's important to take into account the proficiency level of the learners. In one study that he cited, it looked like the students had at least 8 years of study, even though their actual proficiency level varied quite a bit. So a question that remains is whether perhaps this elaborated input could result to more confusion when we're talking about first-year novice level students. For a more complete review of these studies, he suggests taking a look at his book, Second Language Acquisition and Task-Based Language Teaching. In one section of the article, he talks about bimodal input, which is oral and written input at the same time. For example, listening and reading to a text. He says it could increase the odds of incidental learning, that means of noticing forms in the input, simply because we're getting them both orally and in written form. And of course, it is less intrusive than focus on form. And we could have probably 100 separate episodes just on focus on form. We'll come back to that in other episodes, I promise. Also, bimodal input can help us when it comes to elaborated input, because through pauses and changes in our intonation, we can make this elaboration clearer than just seeing it written down. Of course, more research is needed, so any graduate students out there, please, here's your dissertation topic. Lots of great takeaways from this article. The main one is to try to strive for balance and variety of sources and types of input. I agree with Michael Long in that there is nothing wrong with modifying the language in order to convey genuine content. Of course, as long as we stay true to the language. I also see a lot of value in authentic resources, particularly in helping the languages and cultures come alive. And that's why I think balance is key. That's just my take on it. As usual, I encourage you to read the article for yourself and draw your own conclusions. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.